The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The last time we addressed this issue, we were talking about the New Democrats' hope that the government would implement a national action plan to end violence against women. So this week, there was a major push by women's organizations for a national action plan to end violence against women. The same frontline women's organizations in Canada have been really leading the way on gender equality. So a couple of updates for the House. This week in the Vancouver Sun, Janice Abbott, the CEO of Atira Women's Resource Society, a women's anti-violence organization, said, quote, "If Canada has a role to play globally and locally in the protection and improvement of women's rights, it is this. We need, as noted in Amnesty International's 2017 Human Rights Agenda, for Canada to develop a comprehensive, coordinated, well-resourced national action plan on violence against women with specific measures to end violence against Indigenous women and girls," end quote. Now this week, Oxfam issued a report card, the Feminist Scorecard 2017, and it noted, quote, "What is now needed is a comprehensive national action plan to end violence against women." Oxfam noted, quote, "Much to the disappointment of women's organizations across the country, the Liberal government has not committed to developing a national action plan on violence against women." Now, the absence of a national action plan is making responses largely fragmented, often inaccessible, and inconsistent across our country. The Oxfam report card went on to say, quote, "This government's decision to go with a narrower strategy is a disappointment to women's organizations across the country. The strategy will, quote, only apply to federal institutions and therefore lacks the depth and scope of a national action plan which would have responded to the need for women to have access to comparable levels of services and protection across the country." Quote in the So this falls again onto Canada's commitments to the United Nations around a national action plan to end violence against women. The United Nations called in 1995 and again in 2008. Canada signed on to that commitment to have a national action plan by the year 2015. Now, last year in November, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women turned its attention to this government's track record. The United Nations, UN CEDAW, said this government is failing to act on the continued, or quote, "the continued high prevalence of gender-based violence against women, particularly against Indigenous women and girls, the lack of a national action plan bearing in mind that the strategy will apply only at the federal level, and the lack of shelters, support services, and other protective measures for women victims of gender-based violence, which prevents them from leading their partners." The year before, in 2015, a network of dozens of organizations across the country submitted a blueprint for Canada's National Action Plan on Violence Against Women and Girls. This government has got all the tools, all the commitments, all the incentives given its stated platform to take this leadership, but that leadership is missing. And so I ask through you, Madam Chair, why will the government not adopt a national plan? Why such a narrow federal plan to end violence against women?
The Honourable Prime Minister Secretary to the Minister of Status of Women.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member from Nanaimo Ladysmith for the question and for the opportunity to discuss the federal government's approach to addressing gender-based violence. It is fitting that we are here for this debate on International Women's Day because across Canada, this day is about celebrating the contributions that women and girls make to our country and about saying that equality matters. And one of the critical barriers we need to eliminate on the path to equality in Canada is gender-based violence in all of its forms. The Government of Canada fully understands the profound damage to a woman's life caused by gender-based violence, and it is unquestionably a violation of her right to live a violence-free life, which is a basic human right. Madam Speaker, it takes a terrible toll on her family, her career, and her community. We also know that gender-based violence is often closely linked to poverty. Each can exacerbate the other. Without the right interventions and supports, gender-based violence can make it impossible for a woman and her family to leave poverty behind. That's why the federal government is committed to taking a number of bold actions to address all forms of gender-based violence, including violence against women and girls. The federal government has established a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It will examine and report on the systematic causes behind violence that Indigenous and women and girls experience and their greater vulnerability to that violence by looking for patterns and underlying factors that explain why higher levels of violence occur. Over the summer, the Minister of the Status of Women consulted with service providers, researchers, academics, and survivors from across the country that will inform the development of a federal strategy to address gender-based violence. This strategy will also build on the important work already underway in the provinces and territories on this critical issue. These concrete actions underscore the federal commitment to reducing and preventing all forms of gender-based violence, Madam Speaker. On International Women's Day 2017, let's renew our commitment to equality in all aspects of Canadian life, including the right of women and girls to live lives that are not only free from violence itself, but the threat of violence. That's the only way we will build a diverse, respectful Canada that serves all of our citizens equally. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
On International Women's Day, let's hear some good news from this government that it's actually going to honor its commitments to the United Nations and implement a national action plan to end violence against women. I still haven't heard anything from the member that explains why they are not honoring their commitments. A federal strategy is very narrow. It does not get at the actions that the government committed to when it said it would do a national plan. For months, we've been hearing heartbreaking testimony at the Status of Women Committee about how this country is failing women. There's disparity of access to service across the country. 500 women and children are turned away from shelters every night. There's no excuse for this government not living up to its United Nations commitment. Why not a national plan?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Status of Women.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member that in Budget 2016, there were a number of measures which underscore the federal government's commitment to reducing and preventing gender-based violence. This includes, speaking of shelters, $90 million over 2 years, Madam Speaker, for shelters beginning in 2016 2017 for the construction and renovation of shelters and transition houses for victims of family violence. This investment is expected to support the construction and renovation of over 3,000 shelter spaces over the next 2 years. We have also allocated $10.4 million over the next 3 years to support the construction of new shelters in First Nations communities. Budget 2016 also provides $33.6 million over 5 years and $8.3 million ongoing funding to better support shelters that serve victims of family violence living in First Nations communities. Thank you, Madam Speaker.